Mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the REC's Talking Recruitment Webinar. I'm Neil Carberry, the Chief Executive of the REC, and welcome all of you along today to our webinar. Could we just kick off by checking that we're coming through to you loud and clear? Could one or two of you just pop the fact that you can hear us into the chat box? Super, thank you very much, everyone. As you can expect, this is a slightly more held together with sticky tape and glue version as normal, because we're not all in the same place, we're all at home. But thank you all for joining us. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you and get together. Now, one of the issues with this way of doing things is you're going to hear me move the slides on through the webinar, because only one of us is able to do that. So Karen, if you move us on to the next slide. So I'm joined this afternoon on our webinar by the REC's Director of Sales and Marketing, Kate Shoesmith. Kate, good afternoon.
Hi Neil, and hello to everybody else.
And Kate, of course, has been your champion inside the REC. We're all your champions, but you're a particular champion in terms of making sure members get what they need at this critical and very challenging time. And also joined on the webinar by Sophie Wingfield, our Head of Policy. Good afternoon, Sophie.
Hi all.
So Sophie's been critically involved in what has been a massively heavy schedule of engagement for the REC with the government throughout this period. As you might expect, daily calls with trade associations across the economy, talking to Number 10, regular calls with ministers, just trying to get everything right in terms of the scale of response that has had to be put in place since this crisis broke back in March. Today's aim is really to run through some of what we're seeing. As ever, we have loaded the slides with data. You will get them afterwards, so you'll see everything that's going on. We won't necessarily refer to all of it on the webinar, because we want to get some time in for your questions. And also, we really want to focus on giving you the stuff that maybe we can't write down in terms of where we are on some critical issues, like the amount of time we've spent in the last week or dealing with the issue of holiday pay accrual under the job retention scheme would be an example of that. So why don't we kick off by having a look at the latest REC data, just to give you a picture of where we think the market is, and we'll take it from there. So if we move the slide on, Karen, and Kate, why don't you walk us through the data?
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's exactly the one I need. So the first thing we were going to look at is a bit about how clients are feeling. Now, totally unsurprisingly, we noted that there was an unprecedented fall in employer confidence due to the coronavirus crisis. Those of you familiar with Jobs Outlook, you'll know that this is our survey of clients conducted for us with Comres. It's across businesses of different sizes, sectors and parts of the UK, so it covers a wide cross-section of employers. What I would say is the employer confidence falling is not something that was unexpected. This data survey was conducted between the 1st and 9th of April. And employer confidence is often hit by different things. When we had the EU referendum in June 2016, employer confidence plummeted. So this does happen. And the thing that we should hold on to here is our glimmer of hope is that whilst hiring intentions fell in the short term, employers were also saying that they expected to recover relatively quickly, and their mid to long term hiring intentions were relatively positive. If we move on to the next one and look about what recruiters were facing, again, this is our report on jobs data and is taken from during the crisis. So this was conducted in the second half of March and is our regular panel data of recruiters on what's happened in the month just gone. But in this case, we were asking them to what happened in the start of March. So it's right up to the minute data. So we were just into lockdown when recruiters completed this. And obviously, straight away, we saw a dent. When we've been talking to members across the UK, REC members, we know that your businesses have contracted. The indication is that we expect this to be a relatively short to mid-term, although it'd be good to have a conversation with you about how you're seeing this. But this data was not unexpected, because obviously clients just pulled up the drawbridge, particularly on perm placements, and this was across the board in all regions of the UK, all regions of England, but also we did notice across the UK devolved nations as well. And we also saw the temp billings fall sharply. If we move on to the next slide, you can see that the other side of this coin is that the demand also fell, not unexpectedly. If you've listened to any of our podcasts to date, we did one with MZ a couple of weeks ago, who are running a COVID dashboard of vacancy data that they're updating all the time, and so it's up to the minute. And obviously the vacancies being advertised out there have also gone down. What's interesting, but not unexpected, is where did temporary vacancies increase? Obviously, we've got it in the health and social care sector, but blue collar, which will cover the logistics and the retail sectors, where we have seen that upturn. Let's go to the next one. This is, I suppose, the last piece, which is what we did see, however, is that staff availability, which has been a continuing trend for recruiters across the board since the end of the Great Recession, that staff availability has been on the decline. Actually, it did continue to drop, but there was a sense of temporary workers being more available than previously, and that availability has continued to have that impact straight on wages. So there is still that emphasis on moving jobs in order to get a higher salary. What's going to be very interesting for us is the next round of the Report on Jobs survey will be published in the first full week of May. So it'll be really interesting for us to see what the trend was in April. We're not expecting great changes, and we're not expecting it to be a positive picture. Obviously, we've been speaking to many members about exactly what's been happening. But one of the things that I've noticed in conversations with members is definitely been that client confidence, which was at rock bottom, I'd say 3 weeks ago, is slowly but surely returning. So we should see some of that starting to trickle into the data, but this is going to be a long journey, I'd suggest. That was our very quick run through of the data that we've had, and we'll keep publishing those. Over to you, Neil.
Okay, thanks, Kate. I think that's really good insight. And that last point that you finished on is the one I'm hearing most from chief execs of members around the country in the last week or so, which is there was a really precipitate fall in March and into early April in the market. And, you know, many of us have been through recessions before, and we know that the scary bit is where you can't see the bottom. And that maybe has just started to ease in the last couple of weeks. I think particularly if you look at sectors like IT, which maybe didn't fall quite as much in the first bound and it is stabilizing. Sectors like construction, where a lot of sites closed when, at least in England, and there is a big issue with differential rules in some of the devolved nations, but at least in England, construction sites didn't actually have to close, but they closed anyway. Now that they're starting to open up, that's picking up again. So I think there is that story of stabilization, which backs the point that was on your very first slide, Kate, around Jobs Outlook and the Flash Jobs Outlook we launched last Friday, where it's pretty clear that the negatives on Outlook from the client side, and this is certainly what we're hearing from the 500 members of the Good Recruitment Collective as well, the negatives are short-term negatives. And that speaks to a narrative which we'll go on to discuss later in the webinar about how do we recover as the economy switches back on. And if you do have time to check out the REC podcast, yesterday's edition with Ray Newton-Smith, who's a chief economist of the CBI, a former colleague and a friend of mine, but actually one of the most practical and business-minded economists out there. She has some really interesting things to say about the pace of the recovery and what we should expect. And that, I think, is well worth listening to, because it's clear that clients are thinking about doing things differently on the return, but certainly that there's some confidence that will come as the lockdown eases. Now, if we can move on to the next slide, Karen, and skip us on again. Before I hand over to Sophie to talk about some of the details of our work, let me just take you through what the kind of core work of the REC team has been facing into government to get you what you need over the last month or so. And the 4 asks that we set out here were set out in a letter before government had announced anything. And they reflected our primary understanding, which is basically that I left work on the 12th of March thinking, or the 13th of March, thinking that COVID-19 was a concern for recruiters and was starting to slow the market. And I came back on Monday the 16th, Monday the 16th of March to find that the market was just falling off a cliff almost over a weekend. That pretty quickly has moved us into a space where cash flow was the only thing that mattered initially. So getting cash flow support to you became the rallying cry of the REC, and there were lots of things on the undercard that we knew needed to happen. Very quickly, government decided that IR35 reform wasn't a good idea in April. Lots and lots of focus about how we can make sure the temporary work market continues to work, particularly for critical sectors. But primarily, this was about understanding that if you are creating a recession, which is what government has done, by turning supply in the economy off for very legitimate public health reasons, you then need to back businesses with the cash that you need. And that has been our calling card throughout, along with some significant other significant other asks. And we've had really good access to government, better than I've experienced in my time at the REC, and actually I think in general in the business community better than we've seen for many years. We've been dealing directly with Number 10, directly with BEIS ministers and with the Treasury, and have been getting a hearing that has been really good and strong, and government understands the sector better than I think it did at the beginning of all this, particularly around the specific needs of temporary workers. And we'll go on to talk later on about some of the specific policy asks that we put in place for that. But that momentum of activity, daily calls with senior officials and ministers, it has been really important, alongside getting our message out there in the media. Last week's a great example. I mentioned earlier that we were particularly concerned about holiday pay accrual under CJRS last week, and forcing the government to make some progress on its guidance. And we were able to secure really strong coverage for the REC, both in the print media and on the main news on BBC One. So we're getting our voice out there in a way that perhaps in normal times we might have struggled to do. If you move the slide on, please, Karen. So this is probably the summary of what I've just said to you in terms of activity. That daily cross-economy call, including Number 10 in the CBI, where we are the voice of the industry. Huge levels of engagement with all of the key government departments. We're also working with our colleagues at the World Employment Confederation to bring in global insight, and if that's something that's of interest to you, we will happily pick up on that. Making sure that we're working with other bodies in recruitment, and I think being as open access as we can. So where we don't have to make something member only at the moment, we think for this short period it's in the interest of us doing that on open access. So we're doing as much as we can in that way. And I personally have spent a lot of time talking to leaders of other organisations in the recruitment sphere to make sure we're moving together, and actually, as the last point sets out, moving in lockstep with other trade associations, but also with bodies like the trade unions, who have been very practical in some aspects of what they're trying to support the nation to achieve. And certainly we've had some very good discussions with the leadership of the TUC. So that's sort of the headline day-to-day of what we've been up to. Sophie, why don't you walk us through one or two of the specific policy points that we've been raising and making progress on?
Sorry, I was muted. Can we go to the next slide, please?
These are the risks.
Yeah. So, it seems like a long time ago, 1 month or 5 weeks, but we've seen a lot of progress in that time. The government was quite quick to react to the IR35 call to delay that. So we've seen that delayed. We've got temporary measures in place for right to work checks and DBS checks. And we've had, following on from that, we've had temporary changes to procurement frameworks on right to work and face-to-face interviews, which followed the government's changing the right to work checks. We've also had clarity on how the government scheme for the public sector procurement applies, because there's been quite a bit of confusion there. And we've had the business rate exemption for employment agencies. So initially, employment agencies weren't included in that business rate exemption, and we went to government and asked for that inclusion, and we're pleased that that has been announced. The GLA has granted temporary licenses to make it easier for those wanting to enter that sector temporarily, because we all know that that is a sector where there is currently a shortage of workers, working with the GLA license holders. And we've had additional clarity on the JRS functions for agency workers. So firstly, the key point we went to government with was we wanted agency workers to be included in that scheme, and we got assurances on that. Now we're working on some of the very technical aspects, such as the holiday accrual, and our work is definitely ongoing in that area.
Sophie, we've had a couple of questions about that, as you'd expect. When do you think that we might hear from government next? Because I know you've been talking daily, if not every half day, on that.
Yeah, so we've been working very, very closely with government, and I last spoke to them this morning on the particularly on the holiday accrual issue, and we are hoping that at some point this week they will give further guidance. But obviously we have stressed that it's really urgent that this is as soon as possible, so we're hoping for it in the next couple of days.
Just on that, I think we had to do quite an education job with government on how holiday pay accrues for different forms of temporary contract. So what we're desperately trying to get them to talk about is how it applies under different contracts, and most importantly, making sure that 80% of I'm speaking up a bit now because I've seen the comments. That 80% of whatever you pay is reclaimable, even when you're paying holiday pay if it accrues, and being clear that it doesn't accrue to those contracts where it doesn't accrue. So, as Sophie says, hoping for something later this week that moves us forward on that. But as maybe she hints, everything on this is a process of negotiation.
Yeah, and I think on this particular issue, it's such a sort of it is a complex legal issue, but we think that in order to ensure that agency workers are able to be furloughed, is an important one for the for our members to know what liability they may face in the future. So as soon as we have any updates, we'll put them straight on the hub, which is still being updated on a daily basis, twice daily. Could we go to the next slide, please?
Just as we go through, there are a couple of questions I'll pick up here on business rate exemptions. There are some qualifying criteria, and the most important one is that your office has to normally be open to the public for instance, interviews. We are finding that most members who apply to their local authority, and this is in England, are paying out now. We certainly have members who've had the payment through. So if your local authority is saying you don't qualify, do get in touch with us, because we can help out with that. And I note the point from a colleague about the business rates in Scotland. That's something that we'll be picking up.
Yeah, we have written to the Scottish Minister on this to try and get the same as England has in terms of the exemption, but we're awaiting a response from that. So this is just an overview of some of the different schemes that the government has announced in the last 5-6 weeks, which brings you through obviously there's the job retention scheme, which is, the VAT scheme, which you can defer VAT, which is until the 30th of the 6th. And I think we've had a question on that as well. Will REC be lobbying to get reverse VAT due in October to be postponed? And I think that is an interesting point, and we'll definitely kind of consider that going forward. On SSP, businesses with fewer than 250 employees can reclaim a rebate for staff for 2 weeks. On the job retention scheme, government will pay 80% of the wages for furloughed workers, and that is, the job retention scheme is one of the areas that has been a focus for a lot of the detailed lobbying that we have been doing. In the business interruption loan scheme provides interest-free loans for the first 6 months, and it's underwritten by government. And we'd be interested if anyone is using and has been successful at any of these, getting any of these loans, or if there are any hurdles that you still think we should be raising with government. Yesterday we saw the announcement of the bounce back loans, which is loans of up to £50,000 underwritten with a 100% government guarantee. We have also had the small business grants for businesses that receive small business rate relief. This is something that is again a local authority decision, so do get in touch with your local authority, and this grant is to the value of £10,000. And then we have another few schemes, so the corporate financing facility, which is for larger businesses, the time to pay scheme for those with outstanding tax liabilities, and self-assessment delay and business rates discounts. So obviously we will be sending these slides later on, but they're if you do have any kind of questions, please do put them in the box.
I'll just pick up on a couple there, Sophie. People have spotted the deliberate mistake that we didn't catch. Yeah, company directors are eligible for CJRS, but in order to do that, they have to be completely not working apart from their fiduciary duties. So in general, we expect company directors, formal companies house directors won't be furloughed, but it is possible to do it.
Could we go on to the next slide, please? So this is just going into a little bit more detail in some of the support for small businesses. I think we can probably go through these quite quickly, but if you do have any kind of questions, please do put them in the box. So this is the support for large businesses on the screen now, which is for firms with a turnover of more than £45 million. And we knew at the beginning there were a lot of problems getting agreement with the banks on these loans that we heard from members, which is something we raised with government ministers. I don't know if you want to say anything on that, Neil?
Yeah, look, I think there was clearly a number of gaps in the original Civils proposal, and the main scheme I know a lot of agencies applied for fairly early on, and it was a bureaucratic mess, frankly, because it was just a rebooting of the old enterprise guarantee scheme. The changes that were made on the 2nd of April have moved it on. The scheme's gone from lending £115 million in its first 3 weeks in total to £250 million a day right now. So if you looked at it and it didn't work for you originally, do make sure that you look at it, you look at it again. And then the other gaps were clearly there was a medium-sized gap where you couldn't access the Bank of England support, but you couldn't access the original Civils. That's why the large business interruption scheme. And then the other end of it, of course, earlier this week is the bounce back loans. I think that's really important that people are aware of, because that's 100% government guaranteed covered. So you shouldn't have problems with your bank credit department in the same way. And then if you and that can lend up to about £50,000, which is another tool, especially for small businesses, especially where the staffing is largely limited company directors who paid themselves by dividend in the past, which we know is a big gap in the general coverage of the schemes.
Could we go forward, Karen? So this is a summary of some of the other support for recruitment businesses. So it goes into a little bit more detail on the VAT deferral, the business rates discount, the outstanding tax liabilities, and the bounce back loans as announced yesterday, which is for the smallest businesses. Next slide, please. So this is our first poll question. Neil, did you want to do this one?
Remember to turn my microphone on? Yes. So one of the things that we're really keen to understand on today's webinar is how far you've accessed some of these schemes now that they're roughly a month old. So this first question is basically about the loan scheme, Civils, or any other similar loan scheme. So please do fill in this. So have you applied? No, I don't want to take out a loan. Yes, I was unsuccessful. Yes, I'm waiting to hear back. Yes, successfully. So let's launch that now, and we'll see how we go.
Can I ask some of the questions that we're getting in from members as we're listening to the webinar? One of the things, I don't know if we've got clarity on this, is does anybody know about the ability to mix the approaches, so that should you apply for one of the small business grants, for instance, could you also apply for the business rates holiday? Do we know what government's thought process is if you're looking to apply for a loan, what they'll be feeling about you also taking advantage of some of these grants?
So there are some rules, Kate, around not accessing multiple grants, particularly around the business rates and local authority support. There's quite a complex bit of guidance that's been published, but it's you know, if you qualify for one bit of business rate support, you won't qualify for another bit of business rate support, and a lot of that is based around your rateable value of your property. But there is no interaction between Civils and that. Remember that Civils is just a government guarantee, so the decision on whether you're successful or not alone is actually just a decision of your bank's credit department.
That's really clear, thank you. So maybe what we'll do for people listening is we'll make sure we include a link so that you get that access to the government guidance, so that you've got the specifics on that. Thank you.
So why don't we close the poll there and see the results, Karen? So half of you not accessing the loan support, small percentage either resolved yes or no. Probably the number's too small to claim that 2-to-1 ratio of success as a story, but it's better that way around than the other way around. And about 14% waiting to hear back, reasonably chunky percentage of you not sure where you stand at the moment. So that's really interesting feedback. Thank you very much. So let's go back to the presentation then, Karen. So if we go on to the next slide.
Yeah, so as we mentioned, one of the first kind of key areas that we focused on with government was right to work and DBS checks. We're pleased that the government announced the temporary adjustments to right to work checks to ensure that recruiters didn't have to do this face to face. And DBS was also incredibly followed on from that made assurances that they also would accept video links and scanned images to be used at this time. And I think following the government's clarity on the right to work, then the procurement frameworks also followed in terms of their specific requirements for education and for healthcare, to make sure that the people could get into jobs quickly during this time. And we've got further information there if you're interested.
I think it's worth noting that was a very bashful summary of the work you and the team had to do with the Home Office, Sophie. Some aspects of this moved very, very quickly. Government got it. I think the Home Office side on Section 8 checks, as one or two people who I know are on the call will recognise, was a real job of work. So, and I think a real victory for us working with one or two others and the team actually at Bays, who were incredibly helpful in moving things on.
Yeah, and I think what we need to make sure is that those right to work checks now don't change before is the right time. If we could go on to the next slide. So on statutory sick pay, all employers with 250 or less employees can recover the SSP for absences. However, temporary workers are included in that government's calculation of whether an employer reaches the 250 threshold. This is something that we raised with government time and time again, that we didn't want the temporary workers to be included in that calculation. Because we wanted to use the Companies Act definition of what constitutes an SME, and we continue to raise this with government. SSP will be backdated until Friday the 13th of March, so just ahead of the lockdown.
It's worth noting on that, Sophie, that part of the challenge with this is getting the pace into DWP's thinking. This is one of the areas where the Department for Work and Pensions is in the lead, and of course part of the challenge that we've had in talking to them about SSP is almost every free pair of hands in the DWP is focused on dealing with a massive onflow of universal credit applications that they've had in the last month.
Yes, and so we've obviously been raising this quite regularly with DWP, but yeah, that they have a slightly different viewpoint in terms of their department.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
And then if we could go to the next slide.
So if I pick this one up, and as I go past, I'm going to pick up the question on the civil loan from Susie that's just come into the box, which is about liabilities on civil loans. And one of the changes that was made in April was that the level of liabilities to individual directors was significantly reduced, and hopefully that will make civil loans more attractive going forward. But I absolutely get that those liabilities still exist. So well worth shopping around. There are now 40 providers who are providing civil loans, including things like overdrafts rather than just formal loans. So I direct anyone who's thinking about it to the British Business Bank website for some ideas of the other options that might be there, because I think it may be that some banks are looking for are looking for more director backing than maybe they should be. There's a very good episode of our podcast with Simon Connington, who's been through this process, Chief Executive of BPS World, which goes through some of the things you have to navigate to go through the process. It's a good listen if you're thinking about whether a loan is for you or not. This scheme, the job retention scheme, is kind of one of the big two for the government alongside civils in terms of supporting staff. And obviously for your own staff, which is one of the most important bits of the scheme, it's often relatively simple, and the portal is working well. We have reports from members of the first payments from government coming through earlier this week. The challenge, I think, is it is a big intervention, and it is designed to deal with the whole labour market, and civil servants design things to support the way civil servants work. And I think from that point of view, there are clearly big challenges in how it applies to agency workers and indeed umbrella workers. And I saw the question earlier on about the umbrella schemes saying they're paying 80% of pay 80% of NMW rather than 80% of the earnings. All of this is about getting clarity in how the scheme works, and it's not particularly helpful, and this is the point we've raised directly with number 10, that you can only make one backward-looking claim per payroll, because obviously that means you have to get everyone through before you put anyone through. Having said that, this is a huge intervention, and frankly, it's lifeblood to lots of businesses in the sector. That's the feedback that we're getting. It is up to you who gets furloughed. You have choice over what's over the 80%. The critical issue has been how to furlough temps and whether it's appropriate. There have been lots of legal opinions flying around, and my advice would be that government's intention is that as many temps as can be are furloughed, but they also need to understand, and this is the point that we have made repeatedly to them, that furloughing doesn't come for free to agencies. You've got the apprenticeship levy, you've got the payroll costs, and of course you've got in some way for those who accrue holiday pay, and that's not all temps, but certainly those who are employees. You have to find a way to claim the 80% back, and that's what we're working on, and that Sophie was referring to yesterday. So we're working to get this scheme into place. I do think that we're facing a monthly decision from government about extension. It was always likely that government would extend it into June, as they did recently, because what they don't want is a forest of the beginnings of collective redundancies. I think on the whole economy scheme, they will make a month-by-month decision on extension. So at the moment it runs to the end of June. They face a decision early in May, before we get to 6 weeks before the 31st of July, about whether to extend it into July. I think if the lockdown continues, then it probably will be extended into July. If it is not, then what I think we're starting to see in the day-to-day discussions with the other business groups and across the economy in number 10 is a discussion about what does a return to normality CJRS mean? In two ways. One, is there a way that we can access continuing support for perhaps a part-time scheme as we start to bring people back, because demand will not be there automatically when we switch things back on. But also, and I don't know whether we'll be able to persuade the government of that or not, but certainly the case that in some sectors, hospitality, for instance, which we know will remain closed for a while yet. In fact, it's not in hospitality providers' interest to open up until the demand level is a bit higher. If they operate at 60%, they will lose more money than they're losing at the moment being closed. And there we may see specific sectors continue to have access to a continuing CJRS. There, a bit like what we'll go on to say about opening up later on in the webinar, the argument we're making is you need to deal with the supply chains of businesses while you're dealing with the businesses. So if you are a staffing firm in hospitality, your business is not coming back until hospitality comes back. You should have access to CJRS until hospitality comes back, and that's an approach that we'll be taking throughout our work on how things come back to normal. If you move the slide on, please, Karen. So broadly, relations with government are good. They clearly have put a lot of effort into rolling out a large set of schemes very, very quickly. They've listened, particularly in England, in terms of giving at least a decent chunk of recruitment agencies access to the business rates discount. They are working with us very closely now on this question about CJRS and holiday pay, so we are getting a hearing. I think we have to understand that not everything will be perfect because they don't have the run-up that they might normally have. Equally, because of that, sometimes they're doing things aimed more at the outcome than the process. I don't think normally we'd expect the kind of feedback on payments coming in, thanks Paul for that, from the CJRS that we've had now. That's not what you would expect of HMRC normally. So lots and lots of work. I think the way I'd paint the picture is that the first 3 or 4 weeks was about all of us together across the whole economy getting the big schemes in place, and now we are working through one by one the issues that the industry faces, specifically whether it's holiday pay on CJRS or, as a number of you have claimed, have popped in the chat box, getting to the devolved nation governments to make sure that we're addressing some of those issues. Now, before we move on, let's go to our second poll question. So Karen, if you move the slide on. We are interested in how you're using the furlough scheme. We start with whether you're furloughing agency workers and what percentage that you are furloughing. So let's go live with that poll now. And while we're doing that, Kate, are there any particular points from the question box that you want to pick up?
Yeah, I think there's thank you everybody for your ongoing comments and thoughts on this particular question. We know that it's something that your account manager at the REC will have a bit of an insight on, because, and you are asking this in the chat function of the webinar, about what other agencies are doing. So your account manager for the REC will be working with a multitude of agencies, and we'll be able to give you, without naming any names, a sense of who's doing what. So there's always that. One particular point to pick up on is, we mentioned Scotland earlier. Yes, we're also talking to Wales and Northern Ireland. I know there's specifics of those different schemes, but the policy team are engaging across the piece, and it can be hard work. There is one point though that is worth perhaps raising, is our conversations with umbrella organisations. You ran past it relatively quickly, Neil, about the intentions and the spirit of the CJRS scheme, but where are we standing on terms of government talking about umbrellas? Maybe Sophie, you might have a thought there.
Yeah, so we've been raising some of the issues, including the 80% of national minimum wage that as a result of how umbrellas pay their workers. We haven't had a response on that as yet from government, but we've also been talking to FCSA, and we raised this in a joint letter a couple of weeks ago with the Treasury as well.
That's, I think, a critical issue, because the policy goal here is to get access to the scheme to as many people as it can be applied to. So, just getting, I think, particularly getting HMRC and PAYE's guidance right on, you know, some of the questions like Christina's asked just now about if I furlough someone now and the booking's until the 7th of May, but we know it would have been extended, can I continue to furlough the temp? Now, what Bays would say to me is if your client says that it would have been extended, then you can. But you know, our day-to-day challenge is getting as much of this in black and white for you as possible, because we understand that the last thing you want is an HMRC audit in 3 or 4 years' time, looking back over some of this stuff without the defence. So a lot of our work now is about getting clarity in that kind of guidance. I know 3 or 4 of you have said that you've had a bit of trouble with the poll interface. We have been getting votes in, so apologies if it's not working for you. Let's close the poll now, have a look at the results, but we will bear in mind that perhaps not everyone managed to score get their votes scored. And as we can see, I think this probably, Kate, stacks up against our experience of the sector so far, which is that most agencies are furloughing temps, but not everyone. So very much very much where there is that ongoing commitment, and maybe clients are willing to sign a piece of paper that says that the placement would have continued if not for COVID-19. Do you think that's fair based on what you're getting from your team?
Absolutely. As soon as this scheme was announced, we were inundated with questions about how to furlough temps and apply to temps first of all. So and there was that clarification from the Chancellor quite early on, but then we had to wait some time for the guidance to come out. What's not surprising to me is that it is in that under a third range, because I think once people have started to look into the details of it about whether this is a viable solution, has been really hard decision. So thinking commercially about whether this is the right thing to do for your people, including your contingent staff, versus what's right for your business and, you know, the employees that you have there. So that doesn't surprise me. And those that have plans to, I think a number are particularly, from just my conversations, are concerned about this point about you can only make one backdated claim at the present. So I wonder if that's part of the reason why some people have selected that as their option there.
Yeah, and I think that is something that we know HMRC are aware of, but largely because we've hit them repeatedly over the head with it, but we know others have. So hopefully that will clear itself up fairly swiftly as an option. Let's move on to our next poll question, which is more about your own businesses and the decisions you've made, and I'll answer Paul's question about the REC while this poll is live. But if we go live with it now, this is simply what percentage of your own employees have you furloughed, your consultants and so forth. So that's open for you now. Hopefully it works for everybody. And Kate, are there any particular questions that you want to pick up from the chat box?
There's one here that's Fatima's asked about coordination and cooperation between members. This has come up actually as a theme. So we're aware that we've got some members who are working in key sectors. And so their workload has actually grown, which for many of you might think, well, lucky them. But there has been a sense of how do we cooperate and coordinate across that. And so and Sophie's going to mention some of the specific schemes that are available per sector in just a moment around that. But if we can support people in wanting to cooperate and coordinate and make those introductions via the REC, then we're more than happy to. I think the particular point here, though, is a very nice one, is around people offering voluntary support. And we know there is that appetite, and we've seen some great schemes with people working with their local communities and working with others. And if you're happy, we will share some of those schemes and how you can get involved.
Fantastic. So let's close that poll now and have a look at the results. And that's, again, I think, Kate, very much in line with what we'd expect at the moment. So, you know, a reasonably substantial minority of agencies having furloughed a very large number of consultants, and then most in the in the region of maybe a half-ish of staff on furlough.
This is not at all a surprise. Totally based on qualitative, anecdotal, speaking to a number of people. As soon as the scheme was announced, this was going to be the saviour for many of our businesses. So this doesn't surprise me. What is interesting is those of you that haven't. Is it because you're a relatively small company? Have you chosen another option? Or is there something else that you've done? That would be quite interesting for us to know.
Super. So let's move on from that. That's really helpful feedback. Of course, you just chat. Anything you want to share, just pop it in the chat box and we'll pick it up. There have been a lot of questions. We haven't quite got to them all so far, and I think there are probably too many to do and still finish before the top of the hour. But what we'll do is we'll come back to all of the questions offline to the question asker during the rest of the week. Before I move on, I did say I'd answer the question about REC furlough. As you'd expect, this crisis is a challenge to the REC as it is to all of your businesses, especially if, as I do, I run a reasonably substantial in-person training and events business. So we have, like many of you, used the furlough scheme in appropriate ways to protect the cash flows of the REC. But we have a really important decision to make, which is right now we should be here for members. So we are going to spend some of the REC's reserves to maintain service to you. If I were interested in just the profits of the REC, I might do something else, but that's not what we're about. We're a purpose-led organisation about serving recruiters. So our planning is for a sustainable service to you throughout the rest of the year and well into next year. And we're turning on some stuff that we did before the crisis, like our new website over the next few weeks, which will further enhance that. Let's press on to some of the more sector-specific schemes, and I'll pick up Simon's point that we did correct ourselves on company directors and furlough earlier, and that will be corrected in the slides. That one slipped through. So if we can move on, Karen. So really important, if you're supplying to the public sector, the Cabinet Office scheme is about making sure that those on long-term assignments to the public sector continue to be paid. And it is really important this happens, especially in hospital trusts, but also with schools. We have been extremely lively in making this point to the public sector and to schools. There's significant challenges in terms of the pace. Our impression is that hospital trusts are getting better at dealing with it. Schools are still a bit patchy, but we are doing everything we can through the sector groups at the REC to make sure that that happens. And first and foremost, this is a much easier and quicker way to get your temps serving the public sector paid than necessarily having to run them through the CJRS. Let's move the slide on. Sophie, do you want to talk about the GLA arrangements?
Yeah, so as Kate mentioned, there have been some schemes that allow sort of that cooperation, and the GLA have introduced a temporary scheme to encourage cooperation for, there are obviously a number of jobs available in agriculture. They estimate that there might be about 70,000 vacancies in as of May, when the picking season starts. So they've introduced this scheme which allows a established employment business who may not have previously operated in that sector to obtain a temporary license scheme. So work with the GLA license holder to provide workers for the shortages for the jobs that are available with the GLA license holder. So applications are sponsored by an existing GLA license holder, and the due diligence checks are done by the GLA. And so that it allows the temporary license holder to supply their workers through their own payroll, but to the clients of the license holder. It's in place until the 30th of June, but I imagine that may be reviewed if if there's still a shortage of labour in that area.
Good, thanks, Sophie. A couple of questions just to pick up on. Note the feedback from the questions about the Cabinet Office guidance not being uniformly applied. We agree with that, and there's more work for us to do to get that up the agenda. Interesting question from Maureen actually about smaller firms and access to public contracts. We know that it's an area where traditionally government has talked a good game but not moved. We're aware that a number of major framework providers are willing to second tier small agencies onto supply. So if that's something that's of interest to you in healthcare, in particular education, obviously when the schools reopen, then it's well worth getting in touch with the team, and we'll see if we can link you up. Can we move the slides on, please, Karen? So I don't want to dwell on these, but we thought we'd put some content in on these big issues. So let's roll through this slightly quick fire. So Brexit and trade. I was on a call this morning, move the slide on, please, Karen. I was on a call this morning with the heads of the other trade association from across the economy. Government is still insistent that it will do a deal or not by the end of the year. Pretty unanimously, the business community thinks that COVID-19 requires government to take its time and do the right deal. So there is potentially a major break in the business government relationship coming later in the year. What I want to emphasise is we'll move together on that, and it will not be about Brexit or no Brexit. It will be about, because Brexit has happened, it will be about the timing and getting a sustainable trade deal. Karen, could you go on to the next one after Brexit and trade? So immigration, government is still saying there'll be a new system by the end of the year. Pretty clearly that is a heck of a challenge, especially as they recently pulled the bill from a day in Parliament. We have been very clear about what we need, and I think actually in many ways the debate is coming towards us, given that the long-standing REC point that someone's value to the economy can not only be measured by the salary they receive is being demonstrated amply by COVID-19. We will continue to work very hard on this. It remains a significant priority for us. And on again, please, Cam. IR35, obviously we have the delay. The House of Lords Finance Bill Subcommittee has made the case for a further delay to the private sector rollout. I think what's interesting here is when Philip Hammond delayed it initially in October 2018, the REC line then was that this isn't the right way to do it, and that potentially what we needed was a deeper thought about the tax system. I think we're coming to that debate. Rishi Sunak was very clear in this launching the self-employed support package that he would be coming back to how we tax people after this is over. And I think we all know that some of the bills that are currently being racked up will have to be paid for. So I think as part of all of that, we should expect a big debate about tax in the autumn. And it is possible that IR35 will be part of that. At the moment, government's intention remains to go ahead in April 2021. And on again, please, Karen. And finally, we have developed a really good working relationship with the trade unions through all this. Of course, the Swedish derogation was abolished at the beginning of the month. And I think it's really important that we set ourselves out as being interested in great work for agency workers. So this guide that we published with the TUC is about promoting agency workers' rights and establishing that working through an REC member agency is a route to great work. We talk a lot about making great work happen here at the REC, and that's picked up in this. But it's also just a really important reminder that significant legislation happened at the beginning of the month. And as we switch on again, and as you start ramping up as we go through the summer and into the autumn, I think just remembering to have these changes to legislation in your mind is going to be really important. We're slightly running out of time, so let's move on to the next slide, and I will very quickly say two things that are on my mind. Right now, we've talked a lot about getting these schemes to work to support your businesses and our 4 core messages to government. We are hammering that really hard. We're now moving on to, well, how does the economy reopen and what does the sector need? So if you have any views on that you want to feed into me, absolutely do it. Send me an email to neil@rec.uk.com. Get in touch with your account manager. That's the next big thing. But even after that, we're beginning to think about how we position the sector in the new economy, because I think we are going to have to set out why recruitment and staffing makes a massive difference, the huge value it offers to clients and to candidates as they build their career, and the pride that we have in what we do, placing 1 million people into new permanent jobs every year and 1 million temps on site every day. So there's a really big bit of work that we're thinking about that it is, yes, about positioning the sector, but actually it's about there being a massive national debate about the tax system and about the social contract and about how we work that will come out of this once we get through the horror of the day-to-day death tolls. And positioning the REC for that is going to be super important. So just to flag that we're aware of that. Any thoughts you have, really interested in all of that. And before we finish, if we beg of you another couple of minutes, Kate, could you just give us the edited highlights of some of the member support that we've put in place? Because as I said earlier, that is a really critical part of our plan, which is to get as much support behind members as possible at this time and not cut back on the stuff that members really need.
Absolutely. So when you get there, we won't run through, we've got a couple of slides, but we won't run through them now in the interest of time. When you get the slide pack, you'll be able to see all of the information that we've provided to date and the links to that information. Probably 2 key things to make sure that you're aware of. The first is that we have a COVID-19 hub on our website. We're updating our website, so that you will notice some lovely changes to that over the coming days and weeks. So it'll be in line with our new branding. But the COVID-19 hub is there and it's updated regularly with all the information that you require. So every time government announces something, it's put on there, and we make sure that's also fed into our social media feed. So following at REC members on Twitter and Recruitment and Employment Confederation on LinkedIn especially. The other place that obviously is there for you to access information and advice specific to your business is the legal helpline. So the guys, they are taking calls and emails. If you call us, it will send a voicemail to our legal advisors and they will call you back. We were inundated with calls in the first few weeks of the crisis, as you'd expect. We had thousands of people contacting us for support and advice, totally understandably. We've got through that backlog now, so if there is specific advice you need for your business, then the helpline's there to help you. And I'll leave it there.
Super, thank you. And Karen, while I'm talking, if you just want to flick through the remaining slides, because people will be able to engage with all of this content when they get access to the slide pack. As you can see, just keep rolling through, Karen, for me. Lots and lots of content here, twice a week podcasts, webinars on business resilience and staff resilience, all the latest legal pieces. This great piece on handling media inquiries that Kate put together with Shazia Jazar at Head of Comms, because we are seeing a lot of local interest in recruiters' views, which I think is really important. Really good question from Susie just now about anything you can offer for furloughed staff to keep them engaged. There's loads of really good content there. You go, wellbeing support, little videos. The podcast is a really good and interesting listen. All sorts of things that we're starting to push out that is all about keeping engaged, but also thinking about your own business. So anything you need or anything that is really interesting you and challenging, we're doing a lot, but it's really important that the things that we do are driven by the needs that you have as this crisis develops. So stay in touch with me, with Kate, with Sophie. Stay in touch with your sector groups. We've got the dates on the slide now. And absolutely, if you think you need something from the REC, we are here to help. We did have a really, really busy March and April on the legal helpline. That's why we pushed everything onto the COVID hub. We tripled the resources on that from within our own staff, and actually that has now subsided. So you should be getting really quick turnaround from our fantastic legal team. And what reading a lot of shall we say private sector lawyers' advice over the last few weeks has told me is that you do need a lawyer who understands the conduct regs and understands how the different forms of contracts that agency workers work on. And I think Lorraine and the team have done a great job in updating all our content for that. So do stay in touch. Have a go through the slides because we haven't covered anything. We're here to help you. That's the purpose of the REC at this time. And stay safe. Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Sophie, for joining me today. And we'll be back with you soon. Have a great rest of your day.